the second Monday morning musings I ever did back 7 months ago. Didn't know if this would be continuing this long. And it's not that it's a 7-month rotation, but it's that Rabbi Mike Moskowitz has so much important things to share and to teach, and teaches me in his writings and in our communication. And I really appreciate his time in his busy schedule to be with us on this morning. And so welcome, Rabbi.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure. And I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you. For those who haven't read or don't know, Rabbi is the scholar in residence at Congregation Beit Simchat in New York City for trans and queer studies, and has been there for 2 years, I think now.
Yeah, finishing up a third year. Yeah,
finishing up third year. Sorry, and has recently published his book Textual Activism, and fulfilling those studies in a way. I love his description of himself as deeply traditional and radically progressive. I like to think of myself in the same way, though we exhibit that in different ways as well. And again, in his life and his studies, he's been doing a lot of really important work, great work, and teaching us in his actions and in his writings and words. So thanks for being a part of this. It's been, we were talking a moment ago, and you said, it's been a difficult, obviously, time for all of us. Curious how you've been spending these past months and what's been filling your days in the work you're doing.
Thank you. I find for me, the best way to cope is by trying to affect change, by channeling, as much of that energy and anxiety and pain into something that's productive. So I've been writing a lot, I've been studying, I've been, trying to reach different audiences without having, to change out of my yoga pants, not literally, but right. So I was speaking in, in Australia and in places in Europe that normally my schedule wouldn't permit traveling to. So, there's really nothing good about this, but there have been opportunities that have been created. So, trying to kind of give off positivity as a way of preventing some of that negativity from being absorbed.
Yeah. You talked about one of the challenges right now, especially for trans and queer youth, who often have places they can go and be together and connect and be affirmed in their lives. But right now, without being physically to be connected to each other, that necessity right now, finding ways to reach out to help one another.
Yeah, it's particularly difficult. I think the baseline of the world has just been kind of shifted, that it's heavier for everybody. And for those who are already feeling oppressed, already feeling marginalized, already feeling spent, this is an additional weight that is beyond incapacitating for many. For those who live generally in ultra-Orthodox spaces are pretty closeted. Often their own family members don't know, especially queer and genderqueer youth. And so there are wonderful organizations that provide drop-in centers and provide confidential ways of getting together in social spaces for people to actually be out as their most authentic and genuine selves. But because people today aren't gathering in public, those are no longer an option. And many people don't have internet in their house or have computers and are not able or don't feel that the privacy afforded for them in their homes is enough to actually protect their identity in having these conversations. And so it's really been a struggle to try to figure out how to connect to people when those kind of standard modalities are not available.
Yeah, makes sense. Really important. I neglected to mention that what brought attention right now to one thing we want to talk about, the Transgender Day of Remembrance, was something on Keshet, and Keshet, the national gay, lesbian, LGBTQ awareness organization, teaching organization in our country, Jewish, that does a lot of great work, is promoting that, teaching us about that as well. But you are also being honored Wednesday evening at their special event, Outstanding 2020, for the Landris Courage for Dignity honor. You're one of the 3 honorees that night, which is really a beautiful thing to see. People will be recognizing you and the work you're doing. That's so outstanding. So first of all, mazel tov on that. I know you're very humble and looking at it, but really appreciate that they're doing that. I'm looking forward. I have my ticket. I'll be there at 7:30 on Wednesday night. We're putting a link into the YouTube chat, and I'll put it in my Facebook chat later about Keshet and the program, but also about the Transgender Day of Remembrance. And Rabbi, can you teach us a little bit about that and where that's come from and what we can do?
Sure. There are 2 dates on the calendar that highlight aspects of the trans experience in this country. The joyous celebratory one is March 31st, which is Trans Day of Visibility. And unfortunately, on the other end of the spectrum is November 20th, which is Trans Day of Remembrance, where we remember victims of transgender violence. And it's obviously a horrible and sad day. People who present as mainstream society don't worry about going outside, going to the bathroom, going on an airplane. But the pain of the anxiety of getting through the day when a person is in a segment of society that is killed just for being, that's murdered just for being true to who God made them, is something that we think God can't really appreciate or value. And so there's a day that we recall the names and try to bring more awareness to the world. There are different studies. One that's the most popular that's out there, the statistic at least, is that the average life expectancy of a trans woman of color in this country is just 35 years old. And we as a community own that. And every year, the last few years, the board chair of Keshet, Seth Marnin, who's a man of trans experience, and I have been writing articles for Trans Day of Remembrance, and we created this yard site candle for people to be able to light to give recognition. And when I sat down to write this year, it was actually really hard because I thought, like, how is it we're doing this again? How is there even a list? How are there names that are on a list of people who were murdered for being people? And so there's something that I think we all can do, which is to recognize that this is, even though as cis folks, it's not our lived experience, it is the lived experience of many of God's children. The number in this country is approximately 1.5 million-ish, 3 million. It depends on how we count. Just in the military alone, there's 15,000 service folks who identify as trans. And also, even in this week's Torah portion, one of the things that I think for me has been striking this year is that when Isaac and Rebecca are living near Avimelech, they're very much closeted about the relationship as husband and wife. There was a fear that he would be killed if people knew who he really was. And when Avimelech finds out, he creates this proclamation that nobody should harm them. And the very next verse, it says that Isaac lived there and was blessed and toiled, and the reaping was 100-fold. That really the difference between living in fear of one's own life and being able to be productive and celebrated for your contributions is really just that safe space that's created by society. And so I think that for me this year, I think that's the charge, is that we can't have a list again next year. I don't want to live in a world, and I don't want to contribute to a place that has a list of names of people that were murdered for being who they are. So whatever we can do to kind of change that dominant culture by talking about the sanctity of human life, to recognize that God is an all-gender God, is the source of all gender, that we find Adam and Eve themselves transition out of one person. God uses plural pronouns in Genesis 22, and that really the transphobia and the homophobia that leads to transphobia is something that is an evil and that needs to be purged from society.
I really appreciate that. And I appreciate that even though you're a scholar in residence of trans and queer studies, and that's your silo and your focus of your attention, I also see you out there talking about things like Black Lives Matter and promoting other progressive values, which really resonate exactly the same. That why is there still a list? Why do we know these names of George Floyd, of Ahmaud Arbery, things like, names like that are individuals who are just living their lives, who were killed because of being Black, and there's a lot of similarity. Of course, uniquely looking at this in our conversation now, but I think it's important for us to recognize that all, in that sense, we recognize the sanctity of all human life. And when someone is oppressed or someone is facing that because of their identity, whatever that identity is, we as Jews have responsibility to be more aware and to work to prevent that.
Absolutely. Justice is never about just us. And, when people, and it's one of the big problems in Orthodoxy now, this kind of strange alignment with white supremacy. The Orthodox Union honored Jeff Sessions a couple of years ago, and I was part of huge protests. But when a person finally is not the one that's being oppressed, there's this sense of an artificial sense of liberation because I'm okay. And for those who aren't necessarily at the very top of kind of the socially constructed hierarchy, there's this kind of choice. You can either align with those who are at the top and oppressing those below, or right, you can ally up to all those who perhaps have less of a voice in the moment, have less agency or privilege, and less of a platform, to make sure that the fact that I'm okay doesn't make me feel better, but it makes me feel empowered to make sure that everybody else has that same access to safety.
Mm-hmm. You talk about some of the challenges within the Orthodox community. There have been some criticism of the Orthodox community. Again, you've been outside of that, around the coronavirus. I've seen you posting and talking about pikuach nefesh, wearing a mask, the value of that, the importance of that, the mandatory necessity of that in these difficult times. In New York City, of course, we've seen, protests, people burning masks, ridiculous things. Has that been something that's put you outside the community, or is that just a fringe that is getting the news?
Yeah, I think at the very beginning, there were many rabbis who felt like spiritual practice protects, physical well-being. So we're going to pray, we're going to continue meeting in groups. And then when it became clear that just the reality of the world didn't support that theology, because people were dying in synagogues, there was a kind of a retreat from that perspective, and then a recognition that actually physical well-being is spiritual practice. So one of the things that I've written about and tried to frame is that, if we would take as seriously these recommendations and the mitzvah of guarding our well-being as seriously as we take, let's say, the laws of Passover, where, for weeks we're, cleaning and blowtorching, and there are redundancies in the system, and, we sell it and we search for it and we nullify it, right? So if 6 feet is what's recommended as social distancing, so then 7 feet is a bigger mitzvah, right? That, we need to see this as a fulfillment of a spiritual responsibility to God and to all of God's children, that we need to take care of ourselves, we need to take care of other people, and that, Maimonides writes that it's actually blasphemy to think that that religious freedoms could ever be, in opposition to spiritual practice. Spiritual practice is religious freedom, and we are commanded v'chai behem, to live by them. And the Gemara makes a drasha v'chai behem, right, that people should live from them and not die from them. And he gives an example of there's actually great Gemaras. There's different texts in the Babylonian Talmud and in the Palestinian Talmud about, it says that anybody who has to ask a rabbi on Shabbos if it's okay to, let's say, desecrate the Sabbath to save a life, that in one text they're considered to be murderers, and the other text is like it's an abhorrent thing. And the Talmud, the Yerushalmi, explains that that the fault really lies with the rabbinic leadership. That how is it that there wasn't clarity on this issue, that somebody had the doubt to even ask the question? That really the first responsibility of rabbinic leaders and for clergy of all faiths, denomination, people of good conscience is to like create such certainty that there's no space for doubt. You can't even ask the question, because and this is something that for me is very personal. That whether it's welfare fraud or kind of trying to support people who have been accused of or people who are abused children, right? When things are public, we need to either name them as part of our tradition and defend them, or to be able to acknowledge that this has nothing to do with Judaism, and this is about power and institutionalism and all of the things that are often in opposition to God. And so, unfortunately, this is just another example. The good news is that many rabbis have come out and said that this is about people being people. This has nothing to do with Judaism. When nobody wants to be told what to do. People want their freedoms, right? But when you live in a society, there's also rights and there's responsibilities. And so if you're going to be part of society, you have a responsibility not to harm other people and to protect yourself, because that itself is a drain on the resources. So I think the good news is that this is kind of a low bar, but it does, I think, give us space to recognize that the fact that people are doing something, right, even if it's coming from the top of rabbinic leadership, is not at all an indicator that it's the right thing to do. And as we have a better understanding of society, there's still rabbis who smoke cigarettes. When I was in yeshiva, everybody smoked. And then people realized that actually, I also grew up in Richmond, Virginia, and there was a very strong tobacco lobby. But then when the world realized that this was like not good, right, so then we're able to kind of interface the tradition and the reality. And so as the reality of the trans experience becomes more well known, then rabbis are actually going to be in a position to answer the truth of the experience and not their own kind of prejudices.
Makes sense. Sort of also goes along with how we can be allies too. and why we should be an ally and what that means for the LGBTQ community, and for us who are, straight individuals, how we best do that. You wrote an essay or an article, I think I first saw in Times of Israel, about Shabbat to be a time for us to chaver up, I think were the words you used, right? And the idea of what Shabbat means. Can you share that teaching? Because
Sure.
I love that idea, and I want to sort of embrace that this Shabbat, as this Friday is Trans Day of Remembrance. And so by us as a congregation, a quote mainstream congregation, doing this, what that represents as allies.
Thank you for that opportunity. It's one of my favorite teachings. I think that the Hebrew word for ally is chaver. We translate it as friend, and that's true. But really, just like the Latin ally meaning to bind, a chaver really means to attach. The letter vav, the 6 letters, the conjunction and it's a hook. It gets its name from the vave hamishkan, the literal hooks that connected the pillars to the curtains. And somebody who is an author is a mechaber. They're attaching thoughts and words to paper. If something's attached to the ground, it's mechuber the karka. It's attached to the ground. So really, allyship is attaching the resources that one person has with the needs of another to provide support. And the Sabbath, I think, invites us to kind of experience it as kind of an all-gendered experience. As somebody who's cis, meaning that I was assigned the gender that I identify as. It's actually my lack of awareness of gender that makes me cis, that I don't experience gender beyond my body. I'm not aware of it. And there's something really beautiful about the arc of the Sabbath that invites everybody, regardless of their gender identity or sexual orientation, to kind of embrace those things from a different posture. For example, I think in most congregations, there's a custom that we turn around to the Shabbos bride and we greet her Friday night. Friday night in the mystical tradition has a feminine motif in prayers, and I think it's in most prayer books, where it says, it shifts from Vaynuchu Vo, that God will dwell within her. Shabbos day, it's Vaynuchu Vo in him. By Mincha, Shabbos afternoon, it's Vaynuchu Vom in them. So it shifts in this arc from like the feminine to the masculine to kind of the gender queer or the non-binary. And also it's kind of esoteric, but there's actually a deep tradition that we switch the placement of the challahs. Friday night we eat from the bottom one, Shabbos day we eat from the top one. That also has to do with gender. The Shulchan Aruch says it's al pi Kabbalah. So I think part of the recognition is that like my experience is my experience. We're all the result of our unique life experiences. Every Shemona Esrei, every main standard prayer starts with many different gods. My God, the God of my ancestors, and then the avos or the amos, depending on one's tradition or custom. And so there's a recognition that there's one God, and my God shifts from moment to moment and day to day. And so being able to be in Shabbos, which is us being in close proximity to God, the neshama yisera, the additional aspect of the soul, is there also for us to have a greater capacity to appreciate the experiences that are not our own, by being able to kind of explore and experiment, trying to understand and appreciate God in different dynamics. God is masculine, God is feminine, God is neither, God is both. And so the more that we're able to try to understand the way in which people experience these things, it actually gives us a great portal into trying to understand God a little bit better.
I love it. I appreciate that greatly. And it's something that I think we all can live with and embrace more, to be more understanding and open to that as well. Our time goes very quickly. And I said, someone asked me a question beforehand and said, oh, do we have questions and answers? And we barely have enough time just to have a quick conversation, you and me, and to teach a little bit too. And so we'll have to continue that, I think, in the future, because I believe, look, I feel fortunate that our parents gave us the same name, Mike, as a part of who we are, and connected us in this way. Really, it's a privilege that we get to learn from each other and share together. But truly, you've given us so much and taught us so much. Excited for Wednesday night's honor and celebration. Sarah Silverman, I know, is going to be sharing as well, which I find very entertaining and amusing, almost as much as I find you entertaining and amusing too. So it's good, in a good way, right? And her sister, actually, Rabbi Susan Silverman, is another great rabbi who works a lot with adoption and is
We're actually friends. I had Shabbos by her in Israel last summer. Yeah,
nice,
lovely people.
Nice. So yeah, really, it's going to be a special event, and I'm glad to see that too. Can we end with one last thing, a sort of a definition that's come my way, some questions about defining queer, because we hear that being used more and more, and obviously in a positive way. And some older people said, "Oh, you can't say that." I'm like, no,
Yeah.
it's something that is positive as well. So
Sure. It's a name that absolutely has been, a word that's been reclaimed. It used to be a pejorative, but like a lot in the queer community, there's been some reclaiming. The easiest way I think at least for me to try to explain it, is that it's a break from what is assumed to be the standard. So, for example, the assistant rabbi and I at CBST in a queer synagogue as straight folks, like we're actually a little bit queer, right? And so now it's been used as a verb, right? There's queer Talmud, there's queer mikvah. So I think it actually speaks to the essence of kind of reclaiming something that is authentic, that is often kind of was perceived as being outside of the bounds of what was considered to be the straight, kind of the straight and narrow. So this is something that has definitely become expanded, and I'm just one of the recognitions that I think we all have about language is that it's never as expansive as the experience itself. And so one of the ways I think to kind of expand the experience is to reclaim words, to expand language, is to reclaim words that already have meanings and definitions, and to be able to build on that as a way of kind of reflecting more accurately the experience.
no, makes sense. I appreciate that understanding. Okay, one friend is really bugging me about a question. So I asked you this before too, but he wants to hear from you.
Sure.
As an Orthodox rabbi who's
Yeah.
traditional but radically progressive, the response from other Orthodox rabbis in Israel and America, and the challenges around that as well. Is it something that you've been cast out or are still recognized as a rabbi?
Yeah, it's definitely been split. I would say there's much more private support than there is public support, and there's much more private support than there is public condemnation. I think for people who know me and knew me in yeshiva, they understand why I do the work that I do, and even if they disagree with me, they believe that I'm doing it for the sake of heaven. And in that space, people can have kind of sophisticated and complex conversations about what we think is the best thing for the universe, and those conversations actually continue to evolve and are generative. The reality of the trans experience is that it's not limited to a certain geography or socioeconomical class. Like it's part of the human experience. And so there are trans youth, there are trans adults, there are genderqueer folks everywhere, including in ultra-Orthodox spaces. What I think is shifting now is that really for perhaps the first time in mass, people don't want to choose between a religious identity and a queer identity, or a religious identity and a gender identity. And so that's kind of the tension of how is it that I can stay put and be who I am. And I think that also it's perhaps the greatest contribution is that so much of the fear of the universe, whether it's Islamophobia or racism, is a function of proximity, that you actually have never met or gotten to know somebody who happens to be a person who you have prejudged. So it's never fair to ask somebody who's already, overwhelmed and burdened by these things to dig deeper to help those around. But for those who feel that part of their kind of identity is staying in those spaces, it is transformative for everybody who knows them. And so there are rabbis all the way to the top who are encouraging parents to support their trans kids in even the most ultra-Orthodox spaces. Certainly, I would say in centrist Orthodoxy and modern Orthodoxy, the space for LGB and certainly LG, with a recognition that the bi community is a harder sell in those places still, because there's a lack of awareness of what that really means for most leadership. There's huge progress around inclusivity. We think about kind of the spectrum of intolerable deviancies that you can't be here and be queer. You can't. We won't tolerate it. The next stage is okay, I'll tolerate it. I'd rather you be here than not be here, but I'm not okay with it. And then there's like acceptance and celebration. I think that in most places, like we've departed from that furthest extreme, which used to be universal. And now in most places, even like in places in like Lakewood and other ultra-Orthodox places, there's a recognition of a desire that like, okay, this is complicated for me, but if you could be here and everything will be okay, that would be my choice. So like now I have to struggle with how do I prioritize these different truths, that I believe that God doesn't make mistakes and that like it's not good to be alone. And certainly the posture that the ultra-Orthodox world has had towards conversion therapy, to trying to force queer people to marry straight, like all of that has ended, you know, with deleterious effects and horrific trauma, that like it's time for a new conversation. And so those conversations are happening, and there are people who are saying queer folks shouldn't marry straight, and that itself is a recognition of the experience, that you can't pray it away and that there's no way to beat it. The question is now like, how do we address it? So I would say like that's been the biggest shift, and like that's a fair space because I think it is necessary. I know it's always frustrating and it's never enough and it's never fast enough,
Right.
but
Right.
for real systemic change, it is often incremental.
Yeah, I really appreciate the fact that we as a progressive congregation and think that we're doing well in talking to you and reading some things you write and learning from you, realize how far we still have to go as well, even as a liberal reform congregation. So look, I'm glad that on this Friday night at our Shabbos services, Kabbalat Shabbat services, we'll talk about Trans Day of Remembrance. We'll light those candles. We'll teach that. We'll spread that word. Thanks to you. This Wednesday, I'll watch as you're honored and look forward to that too and support that. We will drop both into the YouTube and Facebook links, the Keshet link, so you can get that decal that you can put around your yahrzeit candle and be a part of that as well, and see the teachings there too. And again, really appreciate your time on this Monday, getting together early and starting our day and starting our week with some really important learning, some great intention and reflection, and sharing of your time. It means a lot to us. Thank you, Mike.
It's always a pleasure, and thank you, Rabbi, for modeling true allyship and for showing us how it's done.
You're kind.
It's a partnership,
Kind.
and I can't thank you enough for the friendship and for the opportunity, and thank you for using the name so well.
Representing, thank you. Yeah, both. I will say as well, you know, you talk about the blessings in midst of this challenging time, and it's brought us closer together, which I really appreciate. I do look forward to the time when we can sit together and break bread and share in person as well in the future, and I know that will come. So thanks a lot, and have a week filled with blessings, and everyone stay